Welcome back to another edition of Racing Rundown here on YouTube. I'm Eric DeCoster, and this Kentucky Derby contender profile, we'll be taking a look at Kingsbarns, one of three runners in this year's Kentucky Derby for trainer Todd Pletcher, one of his three winners he had in the final major 100-point prep races. Colt was undefeated, 3 for 3, but has some glaring negatives to his case that we'll point out. Certainly not your prototypical undefeated horse heading into the Kentucky Derby. There's some extreme positives and some extreme negatives that make him a very intriguing Derby prospect for all the right and wrong reasons. He's just a mystifying horse heading into this race. But Kingsbarns, like I said, undefeated, 3 for 3, but he did not race at 2, which naturally leads us off into the Apollo curse question. Of course, the one that justified kind of broke, technically broke, but nevertheless, stats don't lie, numbers don't lie. It's hard to defeat the fact that justifies only one horse who was, since 1882, who has won the Kentucky Derby without a start as a juvenile. Kingsbarns took him a while to get to the race. It's surprising for a colt who was born in January. I believe the birthday on there was January 17th, so obviously had some hiccups along the way, but nevertheless made it to the track. He was an $800,000 yearling purchase, being by Uncle Mo out of a Tapit mare, lots to him, and he debuted very nicely. I mean, it was about as professional of a win as it could be. Debuted over a mile, which is always pushing it a little bit with a first-time starter, regardless of the barn. But he did a really good job, tucked inside, had to wait on horses to find his seam, and he was up just a length or two off of a very hot pace, but nevertheless found his seam and burst through when it mattered. It was a very, very professional win, one that he backed up a bunch when he went down over to Tampa and won a first-level allowance there. Not a great field, of course, but once again, similar trip, had to work through some traffic early on in just his second career start. Smaller field of only 7 horses, but nevertheless had to overcome some things, but took off when it mattered, made it look really, really easy. Third start of his career, goes to Louisiana for the Louisiana Derby after about a month and a half break, and he gets a very interesting trip here. If you drew the race up heading into it, you would have thought, okay, he's one of 2 horses that'll likely contend for the lead. It'll either be him or Jace's Road, most likely Jace's Road. But Kingsbarns drawn inside of that rival. Broke well under Flavien Prat. He realized no one was around him, no one's going with him, and he stuck in very nicely. One, he was never really challenged. He set some easy fractions and took off from there. It was a win that was absolutely handed to him on a silver platter, but he made it look as easy as you could. He won like he should have, given the trip he got. So he's 3 for 3, undefeated. He's had 2 rougher trips. I wouldn't call them the worst in the world, but 2 trips where you could make excuses for him that he overcame. And then the biggest race of his career also happened to be the easiest. I feel like there is a conception about him, though, that he is totally based off of this one race where everything was handed to him in the Louisiana Derby. Not true. He can overcome adversity because he did show that in his first 2 starts. I think that that's something that other horses maybe have not. I think back to a Justify, for instance, as a horse who got a really easy go of things in the Santa Anita Derby, and that was one of the knocks on him leading into his Kentucky Derby. But that's because he also had 2 very easy trips in his 2 prior starts. The same cannot be said for Kingsbarn. So I would like to defeat that conception that this horse cannot handle some challenges in his races, because he did a really good job showing that on debut and then to a very similar effect in his second career start. But of course, that big win in the Louisiana Derby is going to obviously be the one people focus on the most, and it's granted. But I also think it tells you that this horse is versatile. He does have the ability to sit the trip when it matters or make the lead when he needs to. Now, here in the Kentucky Derby, I highly doubt he will be the one carving out the fractions. There's a few horses in here, most notably, I'd say, Jace's Road. I think he'll be a little bit more aggressive early on, especially if he draws inside of Kingsbarns. I think Reincarnate, I think Dermisota Gake are probably the 3 horses you'd be most likely to see go more forward than him. And maybe there's one, maybe like a Wild on Ice perhaps could be in that same little boat. But either way, Kingsbarns will be in that top 5 early on, and he'll be within a length or 2 of the lead at the least. I think that you'd be very hard pressed to find, if he's outside of there, he's not where he wants to be. But that would, I feel like, be the ideal trip for him. But like I said, I think that he can sit in cover, so it doesn't really matter where he draws. He can work out a trip from there, I think, as long as he's forward enough, but he doesn't need to be the most forward. So there's a lot of good qualities to him. The negatives are, of course, didn't run as a 2-year-old, and then lack of seasoning in general, just because you only have 3 starts. This is last year, for instance, the Kentucky Derby had quite a few horses that were coming in with 3 or 4 starts. It was very shocking. You even had one with 2 with Taba. This year's group is very experienced, though. Most of the top contenders have 7 or 8 starts to them. Got started pretty early in their 2-year-old campaigns, ran at tracks like Saratoga and Del Mar early on in their careers, or summertime tracks, point being. So obviously a bit more of a developed group than I think we've seen in recent Kentucky Derbies. And that does play against Kingsbarns. He's one of 2 horses in this field that will be making their 4th start into the Kentucky Derby, the other being Mage. But obviously even 1 race less of experience is going to put you at a slight disadvantage because you gain less, win or lose. And that's something I talk about so much in these lead-ups to the Kentucky Derbies. You want a horse that's been punched in the mouth. I feel like when you look through the winners in recent Kentucky Derbies, even the ones that were undefeated, like a Nyquist, right, or a horse like American Pharaoh, who had 1 loss, that was kind of his punch in the mouth moment, and then won on a very nice win streak. Horses that know how to face some adversity throughout their careers. Kingsbarns has done that first 2 races that I've referenced a few times now. But of course, there's still more that you can learn with more time, and maybe losing isn't always the worst thing. Maybe that truly can battle hard in a horse more so than coming in off a bunch of wins. So that's a concern. And then another concern that I think it's pretty warranted given how consistent it is across every single figure maker is the figures. He has really not dazzled by any metric. Usually what we'll see is 1 metric really love a horse, or a few really love a horse, and then others maybe not so much, or a unanimous decision, like a Forte is right now. But a Kingsbarns is unanimous in the sense that he is a cut below. You look at his buyers, you look at his Timeform US numbers, you look at his Brisnet numbers, all very weak, average, just nothing to write home about. I mean, for instance, Louisiana Derby only threw a 95 buyer. That's well off the pace of most others. I believe that's the second weakest amongst those 100-point prep race winners. So that's obviously a bit of a concern. And while he has been improving his buyers every start, a 74 from the maiden win to an 85 in Tampa to a 95 in Louisiana, it's still concerning that he hasn't run that top number. Now, you could argue, though, from that this will be his peak. And I'm sure that's a good thing, because so oftentimes Todd Pletcher can be viewed as someone who gets his horses to peak a race too early. And I don't know if that's the case here. I think this horse showed a good effort, obviously, in Louisiana Derby, but I don't know if he ran his best because of how easy it was for him. So it's just something you have to balance. That's kind of alluding back to my opening point, that this is a very mystifying horse to look at, because the negatives you can still try to turn around as positives, and some of the positives are knocked down by things like, hey, he got away with an easy pace. Hey, his 2 wins before that were against a pretty weak maiden special weight and a weak allowance field. So he's a fun horse to analyze for these reasons, but they're all things you have to consider. Now, Todd Pletcher, obviously, he's brought plenty of these types to the Derby, and they're not the ones that have typically worked out for him. Always Dreaming, you can kind of make a case, is very similar, because while he made a few starts at 2, he was with a different barn, and then when he switched barns to Todd Pletcher, that's where he really found his groove as a 3-year-old. And so, in my mind, I almost consider him like a pseudo Apollo Curse-Breaker, because he had the races, but when he really became a runner was in that 3-year-old years when he blossomed. So you can kind of draw a parallel there, but you can also draw a parallel for Pletcher to horses like Magnum Moon, who was an Arkansas Derby winner. I believe he had 4 starts in his career instead of just 3 leading into the Derby. But regardless, very similar progression where you break your maiden, then you go to Tampa, you get the allowance win, and then you go to the Derby undefeated, but you aren't able to put it all together because you haven't had enough starts. He's probably the best similarity I can draw to a horse that ran negatively while also being undefeated leading into the Kentucky Derby. Maybe another could be Materiality, who was 6th in the 2015 Kentucky Derby. He was one that had also made 4 starts, but I believe he made 3 starts, excuse me. But his races were pretty straightforward and easy, whereas our subject here, Kingsbarns, has had a tough trip or two to go along with it. So horses you can parallel to, but I'd say the majority of that few did not have success in the Kentucky Derby. Now, finally, another negative point that has been brought to light was this will be his 4th different jockey in 4 races. Luis Saez broke his maiden on him. Then he couldn't go ride him in Tampa or at the fairgrounds because he had other commitments. And at the fairgrounds, he had to ride Instant Coffee, who lost that race. But then Saez committed to Tappa Trice, one of Pletcher's other runners. Flavien Prat committed to his Arkansas Derby winner, Angel of Empire, nearly right after the Arkansas Derby was run. So because of that, they've been kind of scrambling, not many open options. It sounds like Jose Ortiz is going to be who they go with, and probably by the time you're listening to this, that's who they will go with. It's very logical. There's not many other top riders out there. Jose Ortiz, very capable, won a Preakness last year, has ridden well in the Derby, second on Good Magic back in 2018 behind Justify. So a very capable rider, but that's another knock, is that he has been the second choice for many riders, but he has also overcame that on a few occasions. So just a tough horse to get a great read on. Lots of positives that can be knocked down, lots of weaknesses that you can raise with other caveats. So a fun read, one of those tough horses, a horse that I certainly wouldn't blame anyone for siding against because of his upside, a horse I can't blame anybody going against because he doesn't have much going for him in terms of seasoning and true experience. So Kingsbarns, it'll be a fun one. He's a horse I won't have an answer on until the Derby is over, but I hope this preview was helpful. Maybe glean some ideas. Do you like him? Do you not? We'd love to hear because I certainly don't know yet. So if you have a good comment on what you think Kingsbarns might be with a good case, please let us hear it. And with that, that's all I have for you on this preview. We'll see you next time here on Racing Rundown.